In the wake of our discussion of the first question, we have another two, both of which pertain to the same passage in Isaiah. And as we shall see, these questions have very definite implications with respect to the foregoing discussion. In Isaiah chapter 56, verses 4 and 6, we read about the eunuchs and the foreigners who join with God to serve him and to love the name of God, keeping the Sabbath and holding fast to God's covenant. Again, a discussion of covenants. Who are these foreigners? Are they Gentiles or Jews? And as a continuation, does this prophecy of Isaiah apply only in the time of the Messiah? Or does it have a message for us nowadays? If it applies today, what is it saying about the Gentile world's relationship with God's covenant and His Sabbaths now and in the future? So, there is undoubtedly a lot to be said here, and predictably, I think the best way to begin, because, inevitably, while these are two very important verses, verse 4 and verse 6, in order to be able to understand pretty much anything in the Bible, it's always critically important to see it in context. So, I'm reading from the beginning of Isaiah chapter 56. Thus says God, keep judgment and do justice, for my salvation is near to come, and my righteousness to be revealed. Happy is the man who does this, and the Son of Man that lays hold of it, who keeps the Sabbath and does not profane it, and keeps his hand from doing any evil. Neither let the son of the stranger who has joined himself to God speak, saying, God will surely separate me from his people. Neither let the eunuch say, behold, I am a dry tree. For thus says God, the eunuchs that keep my Sabbaths, and choose the things that please me, and take hold of my covenant. And to them shall I give in my house and within my walls a memorial better than sons and daughters. I will give them an everlasting name that will not be cut off. Also the sons of the stranger who join themselves to God to serve him, and to love the name of God, to be his servants. Everyone who keeps the Sabbath and does not profane it, and all who take hold of my covenant. Even them shall I bring to my holy mountain, and make them happy in my house of prayer. Their offerings and sacrifices will be accepted upon my altar. For my house will be called a house of prayer for all peoples. Thus says God the Lord, who gathers the outcasts, the dispersed of Israel. Yet shall I gather others to him, besides those that are already gathered. So, considering then the thrust of these verses, and returning to the question, who are the foreigners, sons of strangers, who join with God to serve him and to love the name of God? And I must admit that there is something of an ambiguity here. That is, on the one hand, we could understand that the references to those who may come from the stranger, from the foreigner, from distant places, but who have joined with God in becoming proselytes, and thus have become part of Israel. There certainly is that possibility, but I have to admit that I personally consider that possibility remote. In a word, context. Because of the context of the references to foreigners that seem to indicate otherwise. That is, returning to the beginning of chapter 56. Again, the chapter begins, "Thus says God, keep judgment and do justice, for my salvation is near to come and my righteousness to be revealed." Now, in context, the prophet is addressing himself in God's name to the dispersed of Israel. The prophet prophetically sees Israel in exile and enjoins Israel to embrace the path of justice and righteousness in returning to God, so that God will also return to them. But in verse 2, we find a strange and I think critical shift. Because verse 2, "Happy is the man who does this," refers in the Hebrew, it's translated as the man, to Enosh. Enosh, you may recall, is, to be rigorous, the name of Adam's grandson, that is, the son of Seth, son of Adam, and thus progenitor of all of humanity, not only Israel. And likewise, in the continuation of the verse, the reference to Son of Man, Ben Adam, well, literally that means Son of Adam. Again, it is a term that would be out of character had the prophet intended exclusively the children of Israel. Therefore, it seems far more plausible that the prophet here is turning to all nations, to everyone, to people indeed from afar, in saying, "Happy is the man, any man, who does this, and the Son of Man, any son of Adam, who lays hold of it, who keeps the Sabbath and does not profane it." The Sabbath, perhaps, as some of the commentators propose, because the Sabbath is a tangible expression of our belief in the Creator and the author of all that is. So, keeping the Sabbath and not profaning it pertains, perhaps in particular, acts of devotion, and keeps his hands from doing any evil pertains to maintaining an appropriate standard of morality and ethics in the way one relates to one's fellow man. Those cornerstones of conduct that, in essence, of course, as we've already noted, are two of the cornerstones of conduct that pertain to the Noahide covenant, the way we relate to others and the way we relate to God. Those cornerstones of conduct, the prophet bids all of humanity, all sons of Adam, embrace as a basis for their personal salvation. And in that light, of course, what follows, lest the foreigner, the son of the stranger, who is, as a stranger, not necessarily part of Israel, For my house will be called a house of prayer for all peoples. I want to stress that plural. It's not for all people, for all peoples, the text reads. All nations. It's not just for Israel. If indeed we were merely referring to proselytes, to those who had converted to the faith of Israel, then we would still only be talking about one people. Because the proselyte becomes, in every way, shape, and form, part of Israel. No, we're not just talking, we're talking about all peoples. That indeed, all are welcome. And I can't help but note, in a similar vein here, the point of emphasis that we find in Leviticus chapter 18, verse 5. Again, simply reading the text. You shall keep my statutes and my judgments, which, if a man does, he shall live through them. I am God. And once again, I feel compelled to stress that the text reads Ha-Adam. We could translate that as a man, perhaps better, Ha-Adam, the man, as mankind. But it refers to all of humanity. I feel compelled in particular to stress here that the Midrash highlights this very point, that indeed it refers not to Israel, but to all of humanity. That all of humanity then is invited, welcomed, is part of this divine promise. All those, again, who join with God to serve Him and to love the name of God, because for us it is an axiomatic principle that God is a just God, and He does not withhold the just reward from any of His creatures. Each one merits reward commensurate with what he or she has done. So, are the Gentiles or Jews? My response is, they could be either here, but there certainly is no intrinsic need to understand the text as referring to Jews. It could be referring to the righteous proselytes, but also to the stranger, to the non-Jewish people and nations who have fulfilled this summons. They join with God to serve Him and to love the name of God. Which inevitably brings us to the final question: does this prophecy of Isaiah apply only in the time of the Messiah? Well, of course, inasmuch as chapter 56 begins by speaking of God's salvation being close, God's salvation coming to pass. And in the final verses that we read, speaks of the house of prayer that God establishes upon His holy mountain for all peoples. And that house is not there. The Holy Temple is not built. And necessarily, I am compelled to understand this message as a message that pertains to that period of redemption rather than what's taking place nowadays. And in a similar vein, of course, I feel compelled to note that we see much the same theme at the very end of Isaiah, that is, to be precise, the next to last verse of Isaiah, where, likewise, in chapter 6, verse 23, it shall come to pass that every new moon and every Sabbath, all flesh shall come to bow down before me, says God. And that's all flesh. That's not Israel. All flesh is everyone. Mind you, the next verse, the final verse in Isaiah, refers to the damnation, the punishment of the people who rebelled against God. But the distinction drawn here is definitely not between Israel and the Gentile world. The distinction drawn is between all flesh who is righteous, redeemed in God, and all those who rebelled against God. And all those who are righteous, all flesh, come to bow before God. So, returning to the question, does this prophecy of Isaiah apply only in the time of the Messiah? Well, clearly, the thrust of the prophecy pertains to the period of redemption, to the coming of the Messiah. Or does it have a message for us nowadays? It definitely has a message for us nowadays. I'm not contradicting myself. That is, of course, there are many passages in the prophets that pertain to the era of the Messiah. But I'll still stress, with respect to each and every one of them, if they didn't have a message for us nowadays, they wouldn't be recorded in the Bible. For us, it is an axiomatic principle. There were far, far more prophecies, veritably innumerable prophecies, that were never recorded in the Bible. Because for prophecy to be recorded in the Bible, it has to be necessary for all generations. So even a prophecy that, strictly speaking, applies only in the time of the Messiah is still recorded in the Bible because it has a message for us nowadays. And on that note, again, if it applies today, what is it saying about the Gentile world's relationship with God's covenant and His Sabbaths now and in the future? At this point, the answer should be clear. That God's covenant in the Torah is indeed binding on Israel, and it is an offering, an outstretched arm to all who wish to seize it. It's not binding on anyone else, but it is one that is a welcome to all the world. Because ultimately, after all, in the broad spectrum, as we noted, from those individuals who actualize meaning in their lives, specifically through their adherence to the Noahide covenant, to those individuals who, in varying degrees, choose to express in their lives, on a votive basis, aspects of the rules of living that are in the Torah, to those, shall we say, at the opposite extreme, who choose to make God's covenant in the Torah binding upon them by becoming proselytes, by converting to the faith of Israel. What everyone is summoned to do is really the same thing: to make life more meaningful, to come closer to God. There is one goal. But since we're coming from all different places, we could have myriad paths that we follow in coming to that one goal. What is important, what is crucial, and in this sense, what is most crucial is that we recognize this is the goal for all of us: to make ourselves more godly, and by extension, to make the world a more godly place. So, of course, in that light, each of us has a role to play. Each of us has a path to follow. But we all have essentially one and the same goal: to be redeemed in God. God bless you.